Welcome back. You're watching Your World at 10. Now, after 3 weeks of Barclays drama, last week it came to light that the New York Fed had in May 2008 written to the Bank of England suggesting measures to enhance the credibility of Libor. Now, these included establishing a credible reporting procedure and a random selection of rate quotes from the 18 banks to reduce the incentive to misreport. The BOE said it would pass on those proposals from the NY Fed to the British Banks Association, the BBA, that actually monitors this Libor process. And I don't know how far that went, but what's clear is that the current Libor system has needed fixing for a long time now. And no, I'm not referring to the Barclays type of fixing. I mean a better process to arrive at the interbank rate, at least one which has more integrity. What can that process be, and what toll will this Libor manipulation scandal take on the banking industry? Well, Robert Jhonson, former managing director at Soros Fund Management and now executive director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, joins me to share his thoughts. Mr. Jhonson, thank you very much for your time and thank you for joining me on this. I want to start by getting your first impression of what you make of this Libor scandal, what impact it's going to have on banks, and the fact that it's not just Barclays but half a dozen banks that are now under investigation.
Well, I think the integrity of capital markets matters very much to the quality of and vibrance of economic activity, productivity growth, and when trust is destroyed because people are manipulating markets essentially to hold these interest rates too high, it makes everyone suspect, everyone more cautious, less trusting in financiers, and it damages the entire system.
But Mr. Jhonson, this isn't the first time that doubts have been raised, right? Over the last few days, we found out that the New York Fed raised an alarm all the way back in 2008. There have been debates on before that as well regarding the accuracy and the integrity of the data being reported as Libor. So what do you, in your assessment, think are the systemic issues with Libor that now, thanks to this scandal, may have an opportunity to be redressed?
I think what's different about this scandal is that the abuses from the financial sector, which became increasingly apparent in 2007, 8, and 9, are now what you might call mature. People are frustrated. There has not been more substantial reform. And with the stresses in Europe, the stresses of deleveraging around the world, fears of another downturn, the idea that regulators and legislators have not cleaned up our capital markets with reform in response to the calamities of 2008 are, which you might say, regaining momentum. People are getting more and more demanding on governments to rein in finance in its excess.
Well, of course, that's a big picture view, Mr. Jhonson, but specifically with regards to the Libor, if we can talk a little bit about what you think would make for a better process in order to proof Libor from this kind of data manipulation that we've seen in the last few years, especially in the Barclays case.
Well, an interbank market, by its very nature, is an over-the-counter market, or what some legislators in America called a dark market, meaning oligopolistic, meaning highly concentrated firms are playing games and setting things to their own benefit. I would prefer to see a transparent, exchange-based system where the Libor is set in a way where people can see the previous bid, the previous offers, or the spectrum of offers and bids around the clearing rate, and see how that changes through time with very high frequency publicly posted pricing, and take this out of this kind of dark corner where people set the rate rather than having market clearing determine the rate. And I think futures exchanges are much better than over-the-counter as a mechanism.
All right, so an exchange-based rate is one way to do it. The New York Fed, in its letter to the BOE, suggested random selection from the quotes provided by those 18 banks. Is this the full extent of reform that you think should take place to be able to fix the current crisis with Libor?
Well, I think the Libor crisis, it affects the pricing of, as you said, trillions of dollars of commerce. But setting that rate should not be that difficult. If it's done transparently and fairly, then we inhibit the ability of firms who key their loans to Libor to push the rate artificially high at times when, how do I say, it works to their benefit profit-wise and to the detriment of the larger capital market that you referred to. So by putting things on an exchange and making the bids and offers transparent, one can, which you might call, diminish that practice. But you still have to be mindful of the capacity for collusion. And many of the people who I follow and admire in financial regulation, in particular Simon Jhonson from MIT, talk about how these banks are just too big. And part of what we need is a more competitive marketplace, and one that's less populated by the large, complex, too big to fail, what they call systemically important financial institutions. So breaking up the banks, as Simon says, would do a lot to reduce this problem.
Mr. Jhonson, but is that even a realistic possibility? I mean, I know academically Mr. Simon is one of a growing chorus that has been calling for breaking up of banks, a system that is not plagued by too big to fail. But is that even realistically possible?
Well, I mean, you could take the same argument, which is the reason you can't break up the big banks is they're politically powerful, and the reason you can't reform Libor in any way or reform over-the-counter derivatives markets is because they're politically powerful. So if you want me to go into the realm of what's feasible, I shouldn't even be on the air, because what's feasible, given how politically powerful banks are, is to do nothing.
Mr. Jhonson,
what has to take place is society has to reach a different sensibility about who is the servant and who is the master, and it has to do some things that were heretofore not considered practical or politically feasible in order to make the reforms to make these now dysfunctional markets return to a place where they serve the process of capital allocation. And it's not doing that right now.
No, I fully understand the concerns you're raising. I also do want to point out that it is regulation that was able to come upon the manipulation that Barclays and some of its officials were carrying out, and now we've seen a huge management change at Barclays as an outcome of that settlement and the outcome of this crisis becoming public. So to some extent, regulation is responding to this, even if it's not responding by breaking up banks. I do want to ask you as a final question, though, what do you make of the impact this crisis will have on several other banks, or the banking system, largely speaking, on both sides of the Atlantic, because more than half a dozen banks are currently under investigation?
Well, I think this episode is one in a chain of what is building resentment towards large, complex financial institutions that were bailed out, are turning countries in Europe inside out to avoid taking write-downs on the loans they made. They always love the free market beforehand, but after the fact they want to turn a country like Spain or Italy inside out rather than write down their debts. People around the world are more and more resentful of the political power of these financial institutions, and as that resentment builds, the detection of wrongdoing, scandals, structural flaws will continue to rise. Just like Jamie Dimon in America went through this hearings and embarrassment over his loss on credit derivatives after he opposed the Volcker rule, just like we are about to see in the United States a big rollout of scandals that relate to banks and their participation in municipalities, state and local governments, and how they've created all kinds of fees and coercive financing so that, how would I say, those regions are now having to lay off teachers, firemen, policemen, and basic services as the financiers are making more and more money. The resentment is building, and it will not go away until the political process starts to take over and correct these problems.
All right, Mr. Jhonson, I appreciate you finding the time to speak with us. Thank you very much. That's Robert Jhonson there.